Hello, welcome to today's skill acquisition screencast, part 2 of the feedback series. So we're looking today at intrinsic and extrinsic feedback. Okay, so as with all our feedback types, we need to make sure we follow a certain pattern. We have to be able to describe where the information is coming from with regard to feedback, because all feedback is information, just where it comes from differs. So the first thing we have to do is be able to describe that. Second thing we have to do is be able to give an example of the different types of feedback, and then as always we have to be able to give the advantages and disadvantages of each type of feedback. Okay, so as always we're going to go through a pattern. When we're given advantages, particularly, we're going to look at giving the stage of learning the feedback is most effective for. Following that, we then need to give some specific information and terminology to explain when that feedback type is either effective or when that feedback type is less effective, depending on if we're given advantages or disadvantages. Finally, where possible, and it won't work with both feedback types today, we're going to look at how we can use confidence and motivation as an advantage and disadvantage. Okay, so we'll have a look at that as we go through, and I'll alert you to where you can and can't use it. Okay, so if we go on from here, let's start with our basic descriptors then. So we've got intrinsic and extrinsic feedback. So let's start with intrinsic feedback. So intrinsic feedback then refers to information from an internal source, such as, and what I'm going to use here, kinesthesis. Okay, so kinesthesis, you should have, if you just put the A in front of the E there, or I've misspelled that. Okay, so internal information from sources such as kinesthesis. Now remember, kinesthesis is that sense of feeling the movement. So if you're going to give an example of that, you will go to here. For example, a football player feeling that they have hit the sweet spot when shooting. Okay, so for example, this football player here has kicked the ball, okay, and they can feel that they've hit it just in the right part of the ball and it's flew into the goal. Okay, so that is an example. They can use intrinsic feedback or feel or kinesthesis to know that they've hit the sweet spot. Okay, on the flip side to that, the opposite type of feedback, because the feedbacks work in pairs, is extrinsic feedback. So extrinsic feedback then is not information from an internal source. Okay, this is the opposite. So it's going to be information from an external source, such as from a coach. Okay, so for example, a football coach may be an example of that if we're going to use this example. So a coach telling a football player they have good shooting technique. Okay, that could be an example of extrinsic feedback. Now we'll just say this, I'll put it into here, information from an external source such as a coach. Okay, it can be, you could see it. Okay, so for example, when you had a shot in football, netball, hockey, you could see it going into the goal. It doesn't have to be a coach, but I'm just going to use that because we're going to use that throughout, and certainly to help us remember the advantages, disadvantages. So we're going to use a coach as our example, but you can just see it yourself rather than it being a coach telling you whether you've done something right or wrong. Okay, so if we put it down to here, you might have here same exercise, but this time rather than the person feeling or using internal kinesthesis to feel that they've hit the sweet spot, this time you have a coach on the sideline who might say good shooting technique when you put it in. Okay, so that could be there. As you can see, it's pretty similar to positive feedback. We've just got to make sure that we talk about the information comes from an external source such as a coach. Okay, so that is supposed to be a coach, that is what they're saying, and that is the shot that's happening there. Now if we go through from here, as I said on the previous slide, in order to make sure our evaluation points are structured, coherent, and we're going to guarantee that we're on the mark scheme, it's important we follow the stage of learning, each feedback. And I'm hoping these two feedback types here, intrinsic and extrinsic, we have used these before. When have we used them? We have used them when we've talked about the stages of learning. So you should already be able to work out which stage of learning that these two feedback types are effective for, because we know the characteristics of different stages of learning directly linked to what feedback they use. So the stage of learning each one is most effective for, you might be able to pause the screencast and just go through your head now what you think they are. Once you've done that, we'll give some specific terminology, and then we'll have a look at whether it has a positive and negative or negative effect on confidence and motivation. So that's our process now. So let's have a look at these advantages and disadvantages then. So what I will say to you before I even go into this, so we're going to start with intrinsic feedback. Can I just make sure when you are doing your notes, it's really important that you have notes that interrogate each of these advantages and disadvantages. And if you can add little bits around, add to what I'm saying, to what comes onto the screen, that will really make your questions better, because you'll be able to use examples examples from that, and I'll try to put examples in where I can. Okay, so the first advantage then of intrinsic feedback, if we follow our pattern through, with this one we can't use confidence and motivation. It's the only one really. So we're going to just talk about the stage of learning, intrinsic feedback. So if we are going to use information from an internal source such as kinesthesis, who's going to be able to do that? Well, the only people who can use intrinsic feedback are autonomous stage learners. Okay, and they use kinesthesis, that feeling, that sense of feeling whether things are good or not, to self-detect and correct errors. Okay, so to self-detect and correct errors, they do not rely on others. Okay, so that's the big advantage here, that it's most effective for autonomous stage learners because they can use kinesthesis, and most importantly, they can self-detect and correct their own errors. They don't need a coach to say, you didn't kick that right. Okay, they themselves can work it out because they can feel they haven't kicked it right. Okay, or they can feel that they have kicked it right. So they can self-detect and work it out. They do not rely on any external source, such as a coach, to tell them how to do it better because they can work it out for themselves. Okay, on top of that, the final thing, which is a really, really important one, intrinsic feedback is really, really effective because it's instant. It's the quickest feedback, okay? So it's instant feedback. So there's no delay in waiting for it, okay? You get it straight away. It's readily available if you want to ask that on, because as soon as you do it, you feel it, okay? Whether it's right, if you can use it, of course, if you're an autonomous stage learner, okay? So it's instant. It's the quickest type of feedback. Now, obviously, when we're going to learn in lessons on how we're going to remember this, the word instant can be really useful because it begins with IN. Okay, which is also the first two letters of intrinsic feedback. So once we know intrinsic feedback is most effective for the autonomous stage of learning, if we can just circle that IN, we know that it's IN stunt, or the quickest feedback type. Okay, so that is really good. We don't rely on anyone else. On top of that, it's readily available there. Okay, now the disadvantages of intrinsic feedback. Now we should be able to work this out now. It is not effective for the cognitive stage learners. Okay, because they don't know the true kinesthetic feel of a skill. Now, what you don't have to write this, but you will know from what you know about cognitive stages, they rely on extrinsic feedback. Why? Intrinsic feedback is not effective for cognitive stage learners because they don't have the kinesthesis, they don't have the feeling. And on top of that, even if they do think they feel something, it might not be accurate. So, it might be that you feel something and you think, oh, I did that really well. Say, for example, somebody is shooting here, they kick with their toe and it goes in the goal, and they have that feeling of kicking with their toe makes them think they're doing it right. But actually, it might not be the accurate kinesthesis. It might not be the right kinesthesis. So it might not be accurate, which is a problem. And the final thing that the reason why cognitive stage learners, it doesn't even have to be just cognitive stage learners. Some people have what is called a low sensory effectiveness. And if you have a low sensory effectiveness, e.g. you're not very effective in feeling senses when you perform a skill well, this can be obviously a massive disadvantage, because if you can't feel, if your senses don't feel, like your proprioceptors, for example, in your muscle spindles, if you do not on the joints, if you don't feel the movement, you've got really low sensitivity of sensory effectiveness. This means you're not going to use intrinsic feedback well at all. Okay, so they'd be the key things I'd be asking you to put on there. So that is our key advantages and disadvantages there. Okay, so that's our first one done, intrinsic feedback. So hopefully you can see how easy it is to do if you use the stage of learning. And then we can get at least one specific point, trying to get one or two really. And then this one works really nicely because we already know about intrinsic feedback being most effective for autonomous stage learners. Okay, so now if we can just justify it, we're in a really good position. Okay, right, so let's move on to our extrinsic feedback then. So if we go on to extrinsic feedback here, now we know extrinsic feedback is information from an external source such as a coach. Okay, so now what we need to do then is say, right, if we use extrinsic feedback, okay, e.g. the coach over here, look, good shooting technique, he's shouting to the person there when they're shooting, who's it going to be most effective for? Now we should know we know our first point is going to be linked to this, so it's most effective for cognitive stage learners because it helps them improve their skills. Okay, it's they rely on extrinsic feedback to tell them how to improve their skills. Okay, for example, the coach, if you want to add that to it. Now on top of that, Because it is coming, right, and let me just get this right. If you're getting feedback from an external source over here, such as a coach, it should be more objective. Okay, what that means, objective, means it's more factual because there is no bias from the individual who's taking the shot to say it to themselves. It's coming from an external source, so it should be more objective, which you could translate into factual, based on data, based on the truth. Okay, so it's more objective, and if it's more objective and it's coming from an external source, this should mean that it is more accurate. Okay, so it should mean that, one of the advantages of extrinsic feedback, because it's objective, coming from someone else, it's factual, it's based on facts, it should be more accurate. Okay, and if it is objective and accurate, this can really help increase confidence and motivation, because if an external source is telling you, such as a coach is saying you are doing this well, and you're thinking, well, it's a fact, he's not making it up, it's accurate, he's my coach, so he must know what he's talking about, this makes you feel good. Okay, so extrinsic feedback can be brilliant for raising confidence and motivation. Now, as we know, cognitive stage learners are the stage of learning, or the level of performance, that really thrive when their confidence and motivation is increased by a coach using extrinsic feedback. Okay, so they are our key sections to start with. That's extrinsic feedback, most effective for cognitive stage learners, and it is usually more objective, therefore more accurate. Therefore, if it's both of those, this can really increase the confidence and motivation of a cognitive stage learner. Now, the disadvantages of extrinsic feedback, and the first one is this: if you are someone who, say, for example, a cognitive stage learner, and all you ever think about is, oh God, I wonder if the coach is going to give me some feedback. I wonder if a teacher is going to give you some feedback. What can happen is the performer can become over-reliant. And what happens, the problem with that is, if you are constantly relying on someone else to tell you that you're doing things well, then this can prevent the development of kinesthesis. So it actually stops you, because you're not even thinking about how you're performing. You're not thinking about any feelings that you might have. You're just waiting for a coach to tell you. Okay, so in this case, it can be disadvantage. It can be a disadvantage or less effective, because the performers, cognitive stage learners, might become over reliant on it. Okay, and that can prevent them developing kinesthesis. That is why it's a coach is really important. That a coach would always tell people or students or their players to start to feel what it was like when they perform successfully. On top of that, this is how we work across from this side. Okay, so it should be extrinsic feedback, the advantage more accurate, but sometimes coaches or external sources give us inaccurate feedback. So say, for example, we've got this guy here who's a coach, but say, for example, he's just one of the dads of one of the kids who's playing here, and he's got no coaching qualifications, and he is saying good shooting technique because this person is toe poking it. Okay, so because it's gone in, this coach is saying good shooting technique, well done. But really, he's just saying that because the ball went in the goal. But in terms of the technique, okay, it was a toe poke. So this might not be accurate. So you could put there, e.g., a coach, praising an incorrect technique even though the ball went in. Okay, now, if this is the case, if the feedback is not accurate, this can directly link to us decreasing our confidence and motivation. So if somebody is giving us inaccurate extrinsic feedback, this will decrease confidence and motivation, okay, which makes us feeling not very good about ourselves, which can obviously then lead to us staying in the cognitive stage of learning for longer, which is not what people want. Okay, so that is our key focuses there. Hopefully you can see how that works. I will talk through in lessons how we can remember this, but ultimately you have got a process. Stage of learning, justify it with some specific points, and then link it to confidence and motivation. It works beautifully for extrinsic feedback, really nice, as long as you can get that specific stuff and then add it to confidence, motivation, and stage of learning. Okay, good notes please, thanks very much.